Hi, my name is Leon Kuperman. I'm the co-founder and CTO of CastAI, and you are listening to the DiscoPosse podcast.
Hey everybody, Eric right here from the DiscoPosse podcast. Thank you for watching. You've got a really cool episode coming up with Leon Kuperman. Leon's the CTO at Cast.ai. And we've go through really an incredible amount of breadth of the discussion we have with Leon. He's both a really strong technologist. Cast.ai is doing some really neat stuff around Kubernetes and the optimization in the Kubernetes space. So they've got a great platform. So this is a fantastic technical discussion, but I actually dig a little bit more into the non-technical and real sort of people and product management that Leon's had. This is an absolute the equivalent of a Harvard Business Review lesson for product management and product development. So big thanks to Leon for jumping on the show with me. I hope you enjoy it. And of course, if you want to make sure that you can share in the joy that is all of the sponsorship that makes this podcast happen, please do reach out. I'll let you head over, go to Veeam, everything you need for your data protection needs. Now, what exactly do you mean by everything you need for your data protection means? That means whether it's on-premises, in the cloud, cloud native, you name it, we got you covered. So let's make sure that we can do that. Oh, by the way, SaaS, Office 365, Teams, all that stuff you didn't realize need to be backed up because you're like, wait, it's in the cloud. Not true. Maybe in the cloud, but not protected. Yeah, ransomware, hello. We've heard a lot about it. Anyways, go check it out. Go to vee.am/DiscoPosse, and you can enjoy the benefits of having come through that link. So big shout out to our friends at Veeam Software. And of course, 2 more quick mentions. Come on, 2 more. No, seriously, just 2 more. What we're going to do is talk about how do you make sure that you enjoy every moment of that beautiful morning. And that is with a beautiful, devilishly good cup of coffee from Diabolical Coffee. I say this because it's sponsored by me. That's right. I'm the co-founder of Diabolical Coffee. We're a fantastic brand, plus the most amazing merch in the business. And we've got a special limited edition shirt that you're going to see coming up soon. So if you're watching this live in June, we are going to launch a brand new limited edition run by Zine Rashidi. Zine is a fantastic artist, and he actually contributed the new shirt design called Devil's Breath. So go to diabolicalcoffee.com, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get notified when it becomes available, or just head on over there and buy it right now. And one more thing, I am very proud to be able to say that I've worked with hundreds of sales teams and thousands of people in the community over the course of my career, and learned how to really strongly connect with people when talking about technology and business value and being able to put together a way to sell products, demo products, and even services. How do you make sure you can map what they need to what you've got? Well, you need the 4-step guide to delivering extraordinary software demos. I'm very proud to have produced this as an ebook, an audiobook, and I also do monthly live AMAs. So you can join in. Just sign up. Head on over to velocityclosing.com. I want to set up a special brand for this one to make sure it was individual in its goals, and we've had a fantastic response. So I knocked the already incredibly low price down to literally $5. No, seriously, $5. Why? I want to open this up to more people. I never want finances to be a barrier to you increasing your ability to further your career and your ability to connect. So whether it's an internal team, whether it's product management, product marketing, technical selling, technical account manager, this is for you. So check it out. Go to velocityclosing.com, grab your book, $5. Really fun. Plus you get to meet yours truly every month for my monthly AMAs. They're a ton of fun, as well as being informative, and I've had a great set of feedback. So thank you. All right, let's get into the good stuff. Leon Kuperman, Cast.ai, you're listening and watching the DiscoPosse podcast. And with that, we jump right in, which is fun. So Leon, thank you very much for joining today. I always enjoy when I can look at folks who I've seen, faces and names in the community. And it was cool when I saw the opportunity for us to chat. And so I'm glad that we got a chance to get connected. So I think for folks that aren't already familiar with CastAI and yourself, if you want to do a quick introduction, and then we'll kind of dive into first where CastAI is going and a lot of the history as well of your own personal history. You got some really neat background that brought you to where you are today.
Eric, very nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on. This is going to be really fun. I'll start with Cast. So Cast is a fairly young company. We're early stage startup. We're focusing on a really specific, what I feel is a very specific industry problem. And if I could describe at a higher level, the industry problem that we're focusing on is when you as a customer decide to migrate your applications or your life to the cloud, so to speak, your general first step is you have to pick a cloud provider. You're picking AWS or Google or Azure or Oracle or IBM. And that first decision is a very critical decision in your life cycle because it impacts basically right now the rest of your life kind of in the cloud sphere. And what I mean by that is you very quickly start to consume over-the-top PaaS services from those clouds. You consume RDS, for example, or BigQuery, or SageMaker, and those APIs, those SDKs, those CLIs, all of that ecosystem becomes native to your DevOps environment, almost for life. And you find yourself, if you ever have to move your application anywhere else, it becomes a really big deal. So we call this problem vendor lock-in. A lot of people talk about it, and they talk about kind of the multi-cloud universe as a myth, like, oh, how are you ever going to get an application to run just as seamlessly in one cloud as the other, or in our case, in both clouds simultaneously, which seems like even more of magic. So we started the company with this mission of preventing vendor lock-in. So how could we get customers in the place where they have choice? And what is the purpose of choice, really? We really see it as three things. The first one is when you're not beholden to one specific vendor, you have more flexibility with what you pay that cloud, right? So if there are financial options for moving your workloads to places where they're more cost effective, you can do that. The second real benefit that we find is what I call 10xing your DevOps, or if I was to put it another way, if you have to learn a lot of low-level SDKs and tool sets, it's going to be very hard for you to pick up that skill set and move it from AWS to Google. So what we're finding is with the adoption of cloud-native tools like Kubernetes, it's much easier to speak to the cloud at a higher level. So you can speak to the cloud using kubectl and all of those surrounding tools versus having to understand the low-level nitty-gritty of infrastructure. And DevOps engineers are the rarest resource. Engineering in general is something that we're all constrained with. So the more we can do with the people that we have through automation, the better we're all off going to be as an industry. And the final one is one that is actually evidence that happened kind of almost too soon in our lifetime, which is there is failure in cloud all of the time. We saw a huge one in November on AWS, and then we followed that up with a big one after that in Google. And we had nothing to do with it, obviously, but it just showed the almost fragile environment we run in, right? Even services in these clouds that are multi-regional, meaning they have their entire stack in US East and entire stack in US West, still have dependencies across, like IAM as an example. And so we really felt the need, how can we take a customer's workload and make it independent of any one single cloud so that if one of those clouds fails, their application continues to run? And so those are the core three missions, right? And their surrounding kind of thread in our company is the use of automation, specifically over Kubernetes implementation. So we don't work with customers today that are not Kubernetes customers or haven't adopted container as a strategy. But if you are in that kind of sphere, there's a possibility for automation to help with all of those three pain points and benefits.
You've really come up with first of all, really three strong value propositions, right? And especially, like you said, clouds go down, they suffer outages. Unfortunately, as is difficult to be a PR person for a cloud company, you kind of got to say, Yeah, that happens. It's in the terms of service. It's in the shared responsibility model. We've sort of laid bare that this is a thing. I joked one time. I was coming to Las Vegas for reInvent, and somebody asked me. They said, "Oh, do you come here often?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I come here all the time. I was there for reInvent, but I go there for VMworld and all these different things back when we traveled for events." And he says, "Do you gamble much?" I said, "Yeah, I run all my prod in US East 1." I don't think he got the joke as much as the other nerds in the line around me did. But like, unfortunately, we don't leverage the deployment patterns and that are available to us quite often. And this is why I was really digging in on the capabilities that you and the team are bringing, because it immediately takes you to, like, this is the first principle of deployment should be based on using the right deployment patterns that protect you potentially from that kind of a situation.
US East 1 AZ, like 1 AZ.
That's
Like
right.
East
Yeah,
1,
exactly.
yeah,
Always in 1A, always in 1A. Yeah. I'm trying to imagine what, like, a heat map of workloads in the AWS environment, and it would just be just like steaming red hot over US East 1, in 1A. It's because what's it like, they almost should make it like a rotating default for the first deployment, just so that you don't know where it is. It goes like a slot machine and just like drops your workload there.
Interestingly, I don't remember if it was GKE or EKS that does this, but when you create a cluster in one of those environments, I think it randomizes the nodes. It randomizes your VPC, like it says, "Oh, you should be in these.
Oh, neat. Yeah.
Pick out of these 6 availability zones, pick 3."
Yeah.
And it looked random to me. I did it a while ago, but I think you're right. There is first of all, there's just a scarcity of resources. Like if you're putting everything into 1 AZ, I'm pretty sure these machines are physically partitioned, right? There is an incentive for clouds to distribute some of that work. You don't need to be running hot in one zone, right?
Well, and we've got the unfortunate problem, and I'd love to dive in with you in this one, that there's the lock-in and multi-cloud are two really challenging phrases or descriptors, in that how we thought it was going to go and how it actually goes are different. And I remembered when I was at reInvent, I forget which one it was, like 17 or 16, whatever, it was a while back. And Andy Jassy said on stage, he says, "We are very proud of what we're doing and whatever the whole value and of us as being customer centric. And we give you the ability to do all this stuff with this ubiquitous available infrastructure without any legal lock-in." And I was like, "Sorry, hang on a second. He just said legal lock-in." And he's like, "Ultimately, that's what it is, right? So you've no reason to stay. You've no contractual obligation to stay. You can just pick up your workloads and move." But what we know is, of course, they run opinionated infrastructure, as any cloud provider does. And like you said, you're going to make a choice architecturally that's going to bind you to that provider, because unless you want to build the right, if you want to hire engineers to build all these crazy abstractions, then you're building things that are not actually solving customer problems for you, right? It's taking people and engineering the wrong layers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I guess, and the other thing as well, beyond the lock-in, was the idea of portability and multi-cloud. And while really true, like, multi-cloud single applications are rare, the portability aspect is an advantage, that you have a protection, right? It's effectively giving you an out if there were a situation and you needed to bring a workload across or bring an application load across, then you now can do it, versus, and that's if you don't architect towards that pattern from the start, very hard to back into a multi-cloud deployment.
So I look at it as a continuum, Eric. So what I mean, are all customers going to get to multi-cloud tomorrow? Absolutely not. We talk about it in very futuristic terms, but my goal here is to give customers a roadmap to get there, right? So out of those 3 buckets of benefits, which through automation and K8s, which ones can you take care of immediately, and which ones can you set yourself up for in the future? And I'll give you an example, right? So let's go back to your example of when I first enter a cloud environment, and let's say I'm choosing AWS, I can make certain architectural choices, right? So for example, I could use an RDS database that uses Postgres as the dialect. So I could use Postgres RDS. Cool, I have a path to use Postgres elsewhere if I choose, right? I've chosen an open source standard that gives me some flexibility. Now, what if I decide that the document DB is a more important element of my infrastructure? So I go all in on Dynamo. Dynamo gives me a lot of great things. Where am I going to get Dynamo if I leave AWS? Never mind if I want to go to another cloud. What if I just want to move that application as an instance on-prem? I can't do that today. So there are a lot of innovative companies that are coming up around as point solutions for just these hard portability problems, right? Lambda is another great example. Lambda is by far and away the largest provider of function as a service, right? And this is one of the ones that I actually have my eye on. I think we have a real opportunity for disruption here because I don't want to get customers to change their Lambda behavior. I mean, they've already written too much code for that. So I find that there's one of two patterns. Either a customer is adopting an open source data plane standard like Postgres, wire protocol, cool. Plenty of databases will support that. Or a customer is using API set that has become so ubiquitously standard for the function that it becomes the de facto standard. And I'll give you an example there. S3 is a great example of that because who would build a different object storage interface today knowing that all of these applications have been written for S3? So you have companies like Wasabi and Backblaze that they said, look, we will give you the exact same interface. You have to change no lines of code to get to data plane compatibility, but we're going to give you a cheaper, more available, whatever differentiated offering on the other side. So I think that's like, you have to have one of those outs. You either have to have an open source out, or you have to have an out that says the industry has adopted the standard. And unfortunately, some of those cloud standards are open source, some are very proprietary.
Yeah, and in fact, probably one of the more challenging situations we've seen recently was where a large provider, AWS, decides to take an open project and then build an enterprise grade sort of service level around it, and thus they fork the project, they choose to open source that, they put people behind it, and you end up with a challenging situation. I don't know, it's not right, it's not wrong, it's not good or bad, it is just challenging because it brings people to a crossroads where they have to make the decision. I'm using it, I get the same API, I get the same front end, I don't have to change my stuff, but I have this reliable, scalable infrastructure. If you're a real purist on the open source side, now you're in a quandary because, of course, you're saying, well, Amazon is creating a commercial and proprietary offering. They're like, but they're open sourcing it. So I don't want to pull us into that rabbit hole just yet, but that's a great example, like you talked about, of, if I'm going to choose an object storage environment, just as if I'm going to choose a serverless, FAS environment, let's be honest, when we say serverless, the first thing that comes into anybody's mind is Lambda. and then you're looking for number two in your head, right? And it's even hard to come up with.
And just a point on that open source piece, because I'm pretty passionate about this. I think the whole tragedy there is that, like, if we're talking about, let's use Elasticsearch as an example, they went and they changed their license model, and they changed it in not a good way for the industry, right? Like, there were times where predominantly open source projects were copyleft licenses, meaning GPL, Mozilla, not great licenses. They weren't great licenses because it was hard to adopt that software in a commercial environment without your lawyers coming down on you and saying, you got to get that out of your code base. It's just not going to fly. So the whole rise of MIT, Apache, to all of the, what I'll call the more free to express yourself licenses, led to vast adoption, right? And there have been a couple of great examples in the industries of companies that have adopted a great license model and have thrived, and probably arguably better technology that have adopted a worse license model and have not seen their full potential. We're not gonna name any names, but I think this whole sad part of this kind of saga was the fact that it forced Elasticsearch, a smaller company, to protect themselves from the giant by changing their license model. And it's not the first one. Like a couple of projects have followed suit.
Yeah, yeah, and it's good actually, and thank you for actually jumping a bit further into that. I didn't. I'm glad you actually have coverage on that, and that's one of the things too, like the the SSPL versus and the AGPL. It's like there's a lot of different license options, and that was tough. And more so was the reaction. The reaction was worse than the action, and then you end up with these sort of PR firms that are effectively having to create press releases saying that, look, we didn't do the wrong thing. So we're like, it's a sad situation that, and it left, now the open Elastic folks, or like open source Elastic search folks kind of struggling going, oh, now I have to choose, which parent I get to go celebrate Christmas with in a divorced family. It's a tough thing that they're like, do I go all my infrastructure's on AWS? Should I just move over to Open Elastic or whatever their choice is going to be, right? So
and who loses in the end? It's the end user, like the folks consuming the technology ultimately lose in this equation.
Yeah, my friend Rob Hirschfeld, we did a whole sort of long run on, at the time I think it was Chef ran into a similar situation. There's a few other folks that have done. And we called it open source closed minds. And it was a real tough thing because what you found is they weren't trying to create a better future. They were trying to stop a better future for a competitor in their minds. Yeah. And like you said, the impact is on the community and the consumers. So, but hey, let's get to happier topics. So CastAI, you've got some really cool, my favorite thing is bold statements. And you go to the website and immediately I'm like, cut 50% of my bill. All right. You had me at cut 50% of my bill. You had me at 10x the power of DevOps. And it's neat. Like when you get those big, bold statements, I imagine obviously it piques everybody's interest as it should. And when they get to that, the 10x DevOps is one that I'd love to dive into because I think a lot of people will hear that and they're like, oh, yeah, marketing phrases. I know. I mean, look, I'm in product marketing. I'm a technology evangelist. I do this stuff all the time myself. But let's dive into what does 10x of DevOps ultimately mean in the CastAI story?
Yeah, so it starts with the argument, like, what do you as an engineer need to know to do your job effectively, right? And the less automation there is in your environment, the more you need to know. So, like, if you go back, let's go back 20 years, right, or more. When you started coding as an engineer, when there wasn't very much around, there was no cloud, you'd all the way back, you'd start in an assembly language, and then there was an abstraction from assembly language to C, and there were a lot of good C programmers, but then there was an abstraction of C to Python or Java, and you went further and further away from the machine. Well, why isn't that true for infrastructure as code or infrastructure as service? Why, like when I write a Terraform script, I have to be very, very specific. I need this machine on this VPC with this subnet. Like, you're abstracting away the APIs, but you're not abstracting away the gory detail of the infrastructure you're putting up. A couple things. One, it's hard to test when there's that much detail in infrastructure as code. But secondly, we don't believe that engineers need to know all of that stuff. And in fact, it's less secure. So you get all of your drift when all of the hard-rooted configurations are in these types of Chef, Ansible, Terraform. All of this scripting allows for a lot of configuration drift. So our principle is, what if we step back and let the customer describe their infrastructure in very higher level terms, so in abstracted terms? I would like a Kubernetes cluster. I would like to have these resilience properties. In other words, I'd like to have 3 masters for resilience. I'd like those 3 masters to be distributed in different regions or clouds, whatever the choice is. These are the clouds that I'd like to use. This is the networking fabric that I'd like to use. And here are my cloud credentials. So now I've just described a very high level cluster. I've let Cast do the orchestration work. At the end of the day, the objects, the resources that get created in the cloud are exactly what I would have done if I did it with a low-level CLI. But I have had to describe none of that gore. And what ends up in the account or in the tenancy is secure best practice environments that have gone through all of that kind of pre-testing of the cluster kind of in a sandbox and have been certified to be robust, secure, reliable, and all the rest of it. So how much time have I said, like if I asked you to set up a K8s cluster from scratch, right now using a managed service, using a very specific high availability topology, that might take you days or weeks. Even using some pre-configured templates, we've got it down to about 4.5 minutes across 2 clouds, about 8 minutes across 3 clouds. Single cloud, under 4 minutes. Highly ephemeral, highly effective. You can throw them into your CI/CD pipeline, spin them up, shut them down, and it just becomes part of the flow. That's what I mean by 10x. I mean, you don't have to think about the low-level details. All best practices are coded for you. Your infrastructure template is as simple as it can get.
And it's as we often hear the jokes and people describe them as you're a Kubernetes, developer, like us, you're a YAML engineer. But in effect, that's, we say it as almost like a pejorative, like, oh yeah, oh goodness gracious, you're stuck, doing YAML. But the truth is, it's not the fact that you're using YAML. It's the fact that what you have to describe in the YAML. That's like you said, I like that with, we can do it without the gore, having to be overly descriptive in those lower layers. Yeah, I like the idea that you've moved the abstraction to the right layer, which is really where it needs to be. It's not that, like you said, you don't necessarily have to be running like a Spinnaker style of across 3 clouds, completely agnostic, but it's like, just run it for your one cloud, but get rid of the unfortunate underlay descriptions that you have to build in every single one of your configurations.
And by the way, you can describe, no one does this, but you can describe your Kubernetes objects in JSON. There is a flag for that.
Yeah.
No one uses it. No one uses it. So just to go back to your point, Eric, the one thing I missed there is like the ongoing automation part. So like once you've created your cluster, there's obviously a lot of work to keep it updated, managed, upgraded, patched, and so forth. Well, if those concerns are removed out of your kind of daily flow, if patching happens automatically, if upgrades happen automatically on a trigger, but you don't have to describe those in a lot of code, it's certainly helpful. The other piece is the data plane. Now, that's one thing that I think we're very strong with that we haven't talked about. Kubernetes is set up, it's got a couple of peculiarities, right? And I wasn't an early contributor to the project, so I can only listen and guess about some of the motivation. But one of the things that it does in an interesting way is it's a very fair platform. So what I mean by that is, given the resources that you have in the data plane, the nodes that you have in the data plane, it will try to distribute work as fairly as possible. From our perspective, that's a terrible property. I don't want fair. I want greedy scheduling, right? I want to pack as much work as I can, assuming that the work is described correctly, like that it's not thrashing. But if the work is described correctly, I want to pack it all into as few pieces of infrastructure as possible, taking into consideration some high availability goals that I might have. That's kind of like the one piece. And the second piece is most customers do a pretty poor job with the auto-scaling tools that are already available in various clouds. And I'll explain why. Every cloud, like Kubernetes is in an unfortunate situation that there's a different solution for every cloud out there. Like if you're going to scale on GCP, you're going to node scaling, you're going to do it differently than you do it on AWS, and you're going to do it differently on Azure. So there's just no single dialect for describing how to scale the resources that you need. So most people, what they do is they over-provision their cluster, and this is a real fact. Like most K8s clusters are highly over-provisioned, either because they're highly described, like their resource requirements at the pod level or the deployment level are overdone, or because the guy that is going to get woken up in the middle of the night doesn't want to get woken up in the middle of the night.
That's right.
Just
The
a
real
lot
reason,
easier.
right?
I just want to have 2 extra machines and someone else is going to take care of that bill, right? And because engineers are typically divorced from the bill in today's world, which is something that's going to change over time. It's all too easy to over provision infrastructure. So unless you have automation that addresses all of those things, it's just that problem is not going to go away.
Yeah, when it brings up the other thing of cloud being ephemeral, and I bump into this oftentimes. I ran into a lot as early work that I did with Terraform. I would, neatly describe my cloud infrastructure, stand up, like a bunch of IaaS stuff, and I would deploy it out there, and I would run it for a while, and then things start to be problematic because what would happen at some point, there's changes in the underlay, and it's fine. It's completely transparent and obscured from my workload. However, it's not obscured from my drift management and my state management, which at the time, Terraform was a little less than friendly and how it go back and recheck for changes and integrate them in. So then I would find suddenly my workloads were respawning, for no real good reason other than like we had something, host changed, application it came back up, life was good, and then Terraform tore it all down to the ground and then rebuilt it again because of one change in state.
Yeah.
So on the state management side, this is where I'd love to dig in. Like, how do you handle underlay state changes as part of the CastAI abstraction?
So that's a great question. Again, like the example you gave is all too close. So from look, when we were building early prototypes, did we use Terraform? Absolutely. It was just like so brutally easy to do. The team went away from it pretty quickly. Actually, I was pretty opposed to moving away from handling kind of. So the problem, so our perceived problem with Terraform is that state exists on the client side, wherever you run the Terraform script and provider from, that's where your state file exists, right? So if you have drift in the cloud, the diff tools, you're right, the diff tools were certainly not there, and they're probably still pretty lacking. So we went away from Terraform pretty quickly, and what the underlying architecture, what we decided to do was, look, the cloud tenancies should be the database of record, meaning we should have as little state as possible. We just need to have the bare minimum state, desired state on our side as possible. And then as we provision, we should be querying the cloud almost like a database, right? Like, give me all instances that have these tags that are responsible for this work. So if we get the latest state from the cloud and we compare that to desired, it's very easy for us to heal or auto heal. So in a cast, I'll give you a couple of examples. If you go and delete a load balancer in an instance in your tenancy by accident, Cast will recognize that within a couple of minutes and just recreate those for you. If you modify it, it will understand the configuration change and revert the change back. So there is always going to be an interaction with customers and meddling with their own infrastructure. We just have to understand how to heal it efficiently and without downtime. And that's the way we've built our provisioning module. From early Terraform experiments, this was kind of the pattern we got to.
And I mean, resilience is one of the important patterns that you describe, and it's part of what we need to do is not just be able to do it, but do it in a fashion that ensures resiliency and availability, which is really, what the main goal of the application, capabilities are. And let's leverage ephemeral infrastructure, but let's not have the application availability be ephemeral. Let's make sure that we architect accordingly and look for that drift change. And it's funny when you described the challenge of those underlays and state management. The other thing that if anybody's tried Elastic Beanstalk, again, I'm big friends with a lot of people at AWS. I use a ton of AWS infrastructure myself. And the first time I stood up an Elastic Beanstalk, just to really dabble around, I think I spent the next 22 days trying to get rid of it because it was like playing whack-a-mole, because it had its own sort of internals around state management and continuous fail. And if you didn't tear it down in the right order, it would just continuously respawn all these different infrastructure bits. And this is why, like I said, I appreciated what CastAI is aiming at, is like, you can handle the whack-a-mole problem of the infrastructure. And like I said, get me out of the business of doing that. All I wanted to do was put a bloody Ruby on Rails app into Elastic Beanstalk, and I spent a month doing infrastructure lessons and provisioning.
Yeah, and part of that is because Beanstalk is so integrated with the platform. Like, you haven't spent the time to necessarily create the right IAM permissions for the role that's doing the Beanstalk work for you. Like, so with Cast, it's very clear cut. Like, you have to create a service account or an IAM principal to allow Cast to do its work. So if you no longer want Cast to do its work, you can go in to our API or console and say delete cluster or disengage, or you can just go change your IAM and say this user no longer has access, and that infrastructure is left alone forever and continues to run, which is, by the way, one of our founding principles. Like, I don't want to solve a vendor lock-in problem by creating more vendor lock-in.
Yeah.
Like, oh,
moving vendor lock-in to the left, right?
yeah, you don't no longer beholden to AWS or Google, but oh, guess what? You have to use my service forever. No. Like we promise two principles here. One, we are going to open source all of the components that run inside of a cluster. So like our CSI driver will be open sourced. Anything that runs as a controller or a daemon set inside will be open sourced. And then the second principle is you can cut the cord at any time. The cluster may not continue to have the cost intelligence or the automatic moving between clouds, but whatever you leave will continue to work without a hiccup.
The other thing that was neat when I looked at the timeline on the team and the platform, it was one thing that jumped out at me right away was ISO certification heading into 21 there, and this it hit me right away of like, oh wow, it's whereas most folks are just like, look, we're trying to solve a pure technology problem. When I see that, it really feels like your team is very acutely aware that you have to solve compliance and availability for that enterprise using technology, but you really went right ahead into like, look, we can maintain the certification. And I'm just curious, sort of, what was the choice and reason to move there fast, and what's the benefit in why you've chosen to do that?
So you have to understand our go-to-market strategy a little bit, right? It's a little bit different than other SaaS providers. So usually a SaaS provider will pick an entry point. So there'll be an SMB SaaS provider. My offering is whatever, $20 a month, and I will continue to gain customers and own that market. Or I'm an enterprise sales customer, so you're going to get a demo link when you sign up, and the platform isn't going to be available, and pricing is a negotiation, right? Based on the founders' backgrounds, like we had very good connections kind of on the enterprise sales side. We didn't want but we knew that adoption of our tool set, whether for any of those three benefits, would really depend on whether engineers were calling bullshit or not. Pardon the French.
Yeah.
So we very consciously have created robust documentation, very strong API set. Everything is. We want the developer to understand that this is a developer-friendly platform, and if we're selling to the enterprise, the CFO or the CTO or VP of engineering, when that platform gets introduced to the engineering team, hopefully one of two things happens. I've heard of these guys, super cool. I've tried it because they have there's an entry edition that doesn't cost any money. Or if they haven't heard of us, they say, oh, I've looked at the platform, it's transparent, the documentation is all there. This is an engineering group that I can relate to. So rather than coming bottom up or top down, we're triangulating the strategy, right? Both groups of people are extremely important. And so just to circle back to your question, why is ISO important? We are taught, just by nature of our backgrounds and the folks that we've dealt with in the past, we have a lot of enterprise relationships. And even our early product market fit customers were like, dude, we're not going to adopt this technology unless you have very strong compliance in place, because you have the keys to the kingdom. So what are you going to do from an ISO perspective, SOC 2 Type 2? We've had FedRAMP requirements. I'm like, guys, we'll do one at a time. So our immediate goal is ISO, SOC 2 Type 2 for security, and then we'll probably expand the compliance platform for there. And Eric, we do come from a cybersecurity kind of like life prior to Cast. So this is not like a shot, like we're not being dropped into a bucket of cold water here. We understand what it takes to get to a reasonable level of compliance.
But the funny thing is that it is a bit of a rarity in that you saw that that was a requirement to gain the audience and to do that as a go-to-market strategy. Whereas a lot of folks are like, they will live solely. I mean, like go to KubeCon. How many of those booths do you see that, fantastic engineers, fantastic people, they're really, really solving a pure technical problem. And then when they go to do an enterprise sale, that's when the struggles begin. And obviously a lot of those you'll see they ultimately become, they get bought by larger organizations, the Ciscos and the Dells and VMwares of the world and such. But yeah, the fact that you had that at the outset, it shows me that sort of the length and the belief in the platform and the company that you are ultimately building for a very strong enterprise go-to-market strategy versus like, let's just see if this works. and then hopefully we can kind of grow from there. So I like the mindfulness of the business responsibility you have.
That debate, minimal viable product versus like the emphasis should be on viable, not on minimum, right? Like I think but a bunch of Amazon guys just wrote a good book called Working Backwards, which I can't wait to pick up. It looks like a fantastic read.
I just bought the audiobook yesterday. I haven't started listening to it, but yeah, I saw that. I was like, I must get this one.
Yeah. And in the podcast I was listening to, I think it was the A16Z podcast where the authors were interviewed on, they kind of talked about this point at AWS where, that between that 6-pager that got it kind of accepted by the business, sometimes it was a multi-month thinking process, right? And you would go back and deliberate until you got to a very thoughtful place for what need you would actually fit in the market. And along the way, you would deal with things like compliance and security and what's the business model and how people are going to pay for it and so forth. So just to your point, Eric, we do believe in kind of a lean approach. Like, I'm not going to build features without very constant stream of user feedback. But at the same time, I do want to look toward the future to make sure that when we get to our final vision, all the underpinnings are there for growth, not just a great product. And one of those really critical underpinnings, which I think my team of young engineers was pretty surprised by, was operational posture, right? So before we even released a beta product, I'm like, all right, guys, what are we doing to make sure that this platform is up 24/7? What is our operational life going to look like? Are we on call? And by the way, for European engineers, which is where our team is, it's a very unusual ask. Like, I think American engineers are used to this 24/7 rotation and someone's on call all the time. Not so much in Europe, right? So we kind of introduced that very Seattle-based approach to on-call process into Cast very early on, and I think it's worked out quite well, because now we're at the point when we're onboarding customers, we know how to respond to operational incidents, and what gives customers the best possible confidence is like, okay, everyone makes mistakes for sure, but you guys are professional enough to acknowledge the issue within 5 minutes, open up a bridge, get communication, like all of those things are already, there's already process in place to handle operations at enterprise scale.
Yeah, making your engineers SREs, because you're effectively going to sell and evangelize to SREs. If you don't live the lifestyle yourself, it's going to be tough to relay that story and the importance. And when you have that customer, now as a technical champion, I mean, ultimately your buyer is not the SRE, and also then important why the ISOs and the certifications and the SOC, like that's important. And I mean, looking at your own background too, Leon, you know compliance quite well. That's been kind of in your DNA for quite a while. Was that I'm always curious, is that sort of choice you made because it's an area of interest, or did you just sort of happen upon, well, we're going to solve a PCI problem and that became ultimately a very strong part of other technologies you built since then?
Yeah. So we, back in the day, geez, it was probably more than 15 or 18 years ago. So we had this very early SaaS e-commerce business that we were building in Toronto. And one of our biggest technical headaches was PCI. Like, we onboarded some very large customers, and PCI was still a very watery kind of nebulous standard. Like there wasn't a here's a schedule, here's a type A, here's a type B, here's a type C, here's the process you go through. It was very nebulous, and so there were a lot of compensating controls. And we found most of our time, instead of building kind of the e-commerce engine, we spent figuring out how to make payment processing secure. And that was just a huge piece of overhead. So was credit card processing in itself something I was super passionate about? Only from the perspective that it was the massive pain for customers, right? Like the encryption problem was difficult. The difficulty of understanding how to hold secrets in a way that if you were compromised, your customers wouldn't be compromised. All of that critical thinking from first principles led us to kind of this compliance company called Hosted PCI that we started many years ago, which is still doing fantastic. But it also gave me that keen interest in cybersecurity, which kind of moved me on through the rest of my career.
The funny thing is, as I look back over your own history, like we probably have bumped into each other at some point in time through some technology community, because I was roaming around York University around the time you were hanging around on the behavioral psychology side of the campus, and I'm a Torontonian by birth, only recent mover to the U.S. But it was funny, and I look at like your own, Cujo's and the other companies that you had in the past, and it's really neat. I said the small world of technology, which is why it's ultimately important too when we look to, what we're doing now and the teams we build with, those teams often outlive the companies that we're at, not just the people. And it's really, when you go to that next company, it's really cool when you go and you say, hey, we've got this founding team and they're starting something new, and you immediately just get on the bus with them. You have no question, because you're like, all right, we've done this before, we can do this again. And I'm excited by the trust that I have in this team to be able to know that we can solve these complex problems and deal with resolution, which is also another sort of Amazon principle. It's not just how it goes great when it goes great, but how do you effectively deal with resolution and making difficult decisions, especially as a business, versus some founders would struggle for, in an ivory tower. Do we go the route of, aiming for certification? Do we just solve this technical problem? Do we sell to big bank? Like you can get paralysis in a business if they don't know how to deal with and say, okay, this is the path we have to choose. We're going to start down this road. This is our next quarter, kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Eric, we knew, like, when our founding, the first time I think we worked together in many companies previously, we had no idea. Like, I look back at it and I'm like, oh I feel deep empathy for our early investors in early companies, even though they did well. I'm like, wow, that was a huge leap of faith. And one of the things, like, when you, as founders that have kind of gone through the cycle multiple times, like, they either get much more passionate about their space, but they've certainly learned from their mistakes. You just can't survive 3 or 4 companies without having lived all of the scars. Yeah. And you understand those paths quite well. But also, one of the things that I'm really thankful for about Cast is we have an opportunity to, because we've done these things in the past, we really have an opportunity to do a couple of things. We can build the business strategically to really have the biggest impact for the industry. Like, it's not necessarily personal goals first anymore. It's more about how do we impact the industry for the long term. Like, if I can get customers to opt out of their 3-year, multi-year, multi-million-dollar savings plan that they pay these CSPs for in advance, that's a massive contribution. Like, I sometimes I feel like, we're in 2021 and we have customers that are signing up for multi-year contracts.
Oh, I know.
back when they were dealing with telcos. Like, you might as well be dealing with, whatever, pick your hosting provider of choice from 10 years ago. And that's the part that I'm frustrated about, the pain point, but also the opportunity that we have, being kind of in a very fortunate situation to be able to impact the industry.
Well, it's It's interesting too. You brought up of course, the concept as a mental model of first principles thinking, and what you're doing is effectively the reason you can make bold statements is because you can do non-incremental, like real, true, you know, exponential level of increase in capabilities and results. And it's funny when I look at cloud providers, like I do this all the time. You know, again, no, not to detract from any of them in what they do, but like I spin up a workload in a cloud provider. And the next morning, they're like, you get the little nurture email, like, hey, great, you're welcome aboard, you're cool. And then 3 days later, I get the little nurture email from the system saying, hey, you know what? If you bought a 3-year reserved instance for this, you could save a lot of money. You think, ooh, 65% savings. You're like, I've just started building this thing, you know. Now an IaaS infrastructure that was long running, that didn't have a lot of optimization patterns and opportunities. It did sort of make sense, but that's the consumer experience right now. And then you run Kubernetes, you've got this whole octopus of architecture. And how do you possibly make sure you're doing the right thing to, you know, find that optimal, you know, packing? Like I'm with you. I want to be greedy in how I pack that thing. I want to find the edges because I want to make sure that I'm not getting buried on cost, because it's very easy to just like, all right, take your best guess, add 50%, and then the engineer beside you says, you better add another 50 just in case. And that's how we do our provisioning. And it's primarily guesswork. And if anything, it's slightly educated guesswork.
Yeah. And Eric, you brought up a really good point on that kind of first experience. One of the first features we built in Cast is the ability to pause your cluster on schedule. Like, so just like when I go home, do I need this thing running? No, like I just want it running up in the morning when I get to the office or when I start working on my code. So like very early on, we realized people are just wasting a ton of money in their dev test environments because they're forget or just too lazy. Because look, if you have a cluster like Kubernetes, that's multiple machines that are all networked together, how are you going to suspend those machines? It's just like a pain, right? So we created this very easy process to look, suspend the whole thing. I'll be back to you when I get back to work. Just bring it back up. It was really a convenience feature for us because we're running on our own clusters.
I could definitely use that. I had to create some, it was a lot of fun. I created the whole project of like doing a Terraform build for EKS. And I even got asked by my internal, like really smart people at my company that they're all in on Kubernetes and they're doing EKS. They're like, it's already managed. It's already easy. I'm like, no. If you're trying to stand it up and then tear it down, like there's all sorts of cruft that gets left behind. How many times have you gone in, especially to AWS as my first example, is like, you go in and all you see is security groups and it's named launch group 48. And you're like, I have no idea what this even came from. So like, because I had to go and like describe it through Terraform was my choice at the time. Like, all right, cool. So it stands everything up, dynamically discovers security groups, does all the stuff. And then when I'm done, you know, deprovision the whole kit, you know, but you know, I did a lot of hard yards to figure out, and it was more of an experiment to make sure that I could do it. Versus, you know, if I'm thinking about running this at scale, that would not be the way I run a production environment at scale.
Yeah, EKS has come a long way, and certainly not the most usable K8s environment in the world. It has an amazing following. They've done a good job with the command line. The EKS CTL is like a pretty good tool. But still, like if you've ever tried to get a kubeconfig file out of your EKS cluster, good luck. Like it's like a good 10-page, you know, I'm exaggerating, but it's a half an hour sit down if you haven't done it before.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, and it's I always I give them the benefit of the doubt that their problem they're solving is very different and so that's not necessarily the first experience that they need to solve for. And I'm happy that I got a friend on the inside, Michaelhausenblast, who's a fantastic fellow who's been working throughout OpenStack and containerization. He was at Red Hat for a while, and now he's over at open source at AWS. And so I'm hoping that, you know, I got Michael on the inside. He's going to do some more to make some of their containerization a little bit easier.
Look, Firecracker VM, which is the kind of open source container runtime, is fantastic, right? Like it is a great piece of open source tooling. And also, like when I was at Oracle, I met a lot because same city, Seattle, like buildings apart from one another. I met a lot of great AWS folks. And this is where kind of some of my thinking on first principles crystallized, because I kind of experienced for the first time kind of a meeting where you would read for the first 10 minutes. And I'm like, can people seriously not do their homework in advance and read the document? But I kind of hated it at first, and then I got to understand the why behind some of the structure, and I really have grown to appreciate the way that first principles are considered at AWS and other important infrastructure companies.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it's not a default, in fact, it's very anti-pattern to how most people, I mean, the first thing they think is someone will say something and they're immediately building the reaction in their head and waiting for their opportunity to react. And versus if you have the very mindful opening, and it's weird, like you said, when you're sitting there and everybody's reading, you're like, this is kind of uncomfortable, but then you get used to what the output is. You have very good discussions. They learn about resolution. They learn about decision making, and the fact that you're thinking about the final experience at the onset really makes you think about how you're going to get there, and it changes the pattern of. I mean, it's funny. Like first principles, a great example too was Elon Musk. An often pulled quote that he had, or it's like an interview he had talked about first principles in batteries. He says everybody told me that there's nothing you can do in this space. Like batteries cost what batteries cost. It's physics, it's engineering. There's nothing you can do about it. He's like, it costs $600 a kilowatt hour in order to manufacture a battery. And he's like, but I'm buried in a first principles thinking mindset. He says, so I immediately just tore apart what it exactly takes to make a battery. And I looked around the world at different ways we can get suppliers for it. And it effectively came down to a handful of dollars for a kilowatt hour. He's like, why is it that nobody's able to take that on? It's because we as humans are not built to make that leap, or we're more afraid, I guess, perhaps of taking the chance that leap can be made.
Yeah, it's the 5 whys principle. Like if you ask why is it humanly impossible, you're going to get to at least one level deeper, right? And then you just keep probing. So a great example. It's I mean, I look at how products are built today versus how they were built like 15, 20 years ago. It's just such a world of difference. Like we've literally come from the Stone Ages. So
Yep. And I often wonder, I mean, you and I are around the same age, so we've really seen a lot. And I remember like when I came into this, I came out of school and I was going to like Linux user groups. And it was me and like this like 22-year-old kid with a bunch of gray beards, and but I worked at a company. I worked at Sun Life Financial, and as anybody who goes to my LinkedIn, they would see it, right? And here I am in a mainframe centric environment. And we were all token ring. And like, it was all this old school technology that people would laugh about. But I'm like, this is a multi-billion-dollar organization that's wrapped around these technologies. Has since then have gone through incredible changes in the organization. But so my exposure was hang around with the historians and learn what they went through to get to here. And then now what I went through my own history, going to distributed, going to cloud, going to containerization, OpenStack, all these different things, I have a great appreciation for the leaps that need to be made in jumping from one platform to another. And I wonder, so think about it, if Leon goes to school today and takes the same program you've got, would you have the same appreciation being born in a world where you can go to the cloud and then get it now?
That's a good point, Eric. And like I'll give you, I just had a conversation with our architect. He was describing K8s to a technology user, but wasn't necessarily a Kubernetes user. And he kind of described this, and he goes, "Oh, so basically it's distributed mainframes where you order chunks of compute to do a job, and you get a result." Like, yeah, I mean, I think there are certain concepts that are evergreen. They come first, full circle, right? But just to go back to your question on would the education be the same? I think like I'm most thankful for my computer science education in the aspects that were deeply rooted in distributed system concepts, compiler concepts, operating system. Like how does an operating system work? How does swap memory work? Like how does a disk partition work? Like those core concepts are like those are the ones that I cherish because I can always go back to them. Like no matter how complex the problem is in today's modern architecture, you can always go back to those first understandings of how computers work and kind of work your way back. So I hope and I think that part of today's computer science education is very similar to what we would have gone through or what I would have gone through. There are certainly add-ons and aspects that we never had an opportunity to kind of engage with.
Yeah, so we were going through and learning about like X25 and different like communication protocols that are long gone, but like it's the foundations that we were learning that ultimately played out.
Like, do you think students today learn PDP-11 assembler and on like an emulator? Probably not. But man, it was very valuable to understand how a machine worked at that kind of low level.
One thing that's funny that especially when you get out and you experience like how, the technology that you learned about, and then you see the world in practice, especially at an enterprise level, you realize like you come in and you're all like, all right, this is cool. We're going to go all towards this amazing new thing. And they say like, okay, you're excited, kid. Don't worry, that'll wear off. But now I like that there really is an embrace of new thinking in the enterprise. And in fact, I would bet that most banks have more developers than most technology companies.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. It's real. The evolution is unbelievable, and I'm excited to see what comes next. It's as the industry. So our problem right now isn't really a shortage of technology; it's a shortage of really smart people that want to get into computer science and cybersecurity and all of the adjacent fields. So we really have to do a much better job of attracting brilliant minds to the field, because our limit right now is who we can attract to solve these very tough problems in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because especially cybersecurity, if I look at an area that's number one, underrepresented in general, people with a skill set, and then within it, underrepresentation, as far as general diversity, it's a real struggling area. And the hard part, I think, is the patience of humans that we see like, hey, we need more people in security. Perfect. So we say this is a problem. We create programs around it. It's going to take effectively a generation to realize that cohort. And it's tough because we kind of have the problem now. But I think access to information, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this, like compare today's access to rapid information, if you wanted to do something for your own personal learning journey 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was very different versus now. I think people can get there faster. And I think hopefully that we've got the right ecosystem to allow them to do that.
Yeah, like my first machine learning course back years ago was Andrew Ng, like the Stanford 101 course, which is like on Coursera. Fantastic. Like would have never been able to go through that type of rigorous learning process unless I was back at school, right? And most people can't afford to do that.
Yeah, you hear the stories of like the Steve Jobses of the world and Kevin Mitnick's, and you always read their early biographies, and it's all this thing of like, I was having to go to the university to get like 1 hour at 4 a.m. on a Thursday night. It was the only time I could get compute time. And you're like, wow, we've got so much access. It's very much democratized and commoditized. It's still not free, but very accessible. And there's lots of places to go, to find a peer group that have also walked the walk with you versus, back then, first principles was really big first principles because it had never existed to do this in a computing platform. It was very manual.
Yeah. And I'll just on the support groups, like we've been spending a lot of time with with Kubernetes meetups and cloud native meetups. I got to tell you that some of the deep questions that are coming out of those interactions are unbelievable. Like people really want to get to the bottom, and then they also have tremendous insight that like I was expecting some good validation and some great questions, but then what the benefit that we got out of it was ideas were coming out of these groups. Like, hey, have you thought about the problem in this way, or the pain the pain that if you should really think about is this problem, because here's my example. So like I'm all in on these meetups. I think, especially with this virtualization through COVID, they've become so valuable for engineers to exchange ideas.
Yeah, I've been amazed by the new people I've met and very much stayed close to through those meetups. Like I ended up discovering, through I think it was like a Google meetup for Kubernetes, and I presented, at one of them, and I met this fellow named Archie, who he worked for a company called CloudOps in Montreal, and they were from Montreal coming over to here to Toronto to do it, and I was like, oh, that's really cool. And then we kept in touch, worked more with the CloudOps folks, and then ultimately met another person. And through this ecosystem now, we've legitimately, done commercial business together and stayed very close personally. That helped me on the learning journey for a lot of things. And I think that's what I hope that we can introduce new people to, is that if you're fresh out of school or you're still in school, there's so much more access to a peer community that can really, really like effectively kind of 10x your learning capabilities, because you have someone to lean on versus having to hope that you can find it in a book.
How is the tech scene in Montreal? It seems like I'm hearing more and more kind of startup stories coming out of that part of the country. It was pretty cool.
Yeah,
It used to be Toronto.
it is always funny to see, like, of course, the Canadian startup scene, not well known, although it was kind of interesting to see the other day when I saw BlackBerry suddenly get a huge bump on the stock. People are like, wait a second, BlackBerry's still a thing. But yeah, Montreal, definitely a good amount of technologists that are there. The challenge with Montreal and anywhere in Quebec, of course, is the language difference. So in Quebec, of course, they need to be fully bilingual. If you work for any government agency. So I've got kids, and my older kids are fully bilingual. I make sure to do that to kind of open up the doors for them. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested. When I started, my belief was I would never work for a startup in Toronto, because like my hope, I'm like, I can become an architect. I was a systems architect, at Sun Life and Manulife and Raymond James. I did all. I thought that was my world, wherever it's somewhere on the subway line in the financial district. But the world opened up. It was always open. I just didn't go digging for it. Like, so now all of a sudden I was working for a Boston-based company remotely. And since then I've now moved to the US. But, it's funny looking at your history. I'm curious, you've worked for a lot of West Coast technology firms for a long time. What made you make the jump from Toronto to head to that way? And how much of it was done from Toronto versus you having to actually be there?
So we moved to the West Coast for in 2007, and it was really uh, like there was a job opportunity, but I really wanted to experience like sunshine and ocean weather, and we didn't know if we would like Los Angeles or not as a place to live. But what was interesting with this COVID thing that happened this summer, was the spring and the summer, as I was leaving Oracle, my wife and I were walking in San Fernando Valley for a daily walk, and she's like, I'm worried about our parents with this COVID thing. We got a lot of family in Toronto. What if something happens? What if we're not going to be able to see them again? And I'm like, you know what? You're right. My folks, your folks, grandparents, kids deserve to be with their grandparents too. And what if this is a fleeting opportunity? So we actually moved back.
Oh,
It
wow.
was a very unusual thing, and like we didn't know there would be this crazy spike in Los Angeles, but we picked up in the middle of COVID, hired a big moving company, and hauled all the way back to Toronto. Now, having experienced this winter, I'm not sure that I want to be here in February next year, but maybe that's just a month or two out of the year that we're not here.
You just sort of muscle through it. It's I'll put you right in the middle. Obviously family reasons, and that's actually why I ended up coming back to Toronto. I lived in Vancouver for 6 years, and if you like lifestyle and you use the lifestyle, it's a fantastic place to live. And especially now with remote working opportunities, I think it'd be very cool. It was hard to find a local job for many people, especially entry level stuff. I came as a senior from Toronto, so when I would go there, they'd be like, "Oh, we've got a pretty big environment. It's like about 75 servers." I'm like, "I've got more DNS servers than that, so that I manage. So, yeah, I think we're good to go on the scale."
You know what's interesting about Vancouver? I think a lot of U.S. West Coast companies are using Vancouver as a staging ground because of the lack of H-1B visas, which is a political problem. But like, hey, you're on the same time zone. You're within 3 hours drive of Seattle. There's a pretty good synergy, and I think a lot of folks are using Vancouver, and I think has a really strong chance of evolving into its own very strong tech community over time if that pattern continues.
I do hope so. It's such a beautiful city and just amazing people there. It's such a, I really do enjoy the West Coast sort of mentality there. And I was happy to be there. I came back for family reasons, kind of similar to your situation. And it was like, okay, well, you do the right thing, for family at the time. I definitely don't take any negative from having done it. But yeah, beautiful opportunity. Funny, Blaine, Washington is always my favorite little tiny spot, just on the other side of the border. The most mailboxes per capita, because it's mostly people from Vancouver who drive down and get stuff shipped to to U.S. addresses. A little bit different now because you can get more stuff shipped internationally, but that used to be a big thing when I was there.
Yeah, like, look, I mean, even today, like the Canadian system has a lot of benefits, but I'll tell you, like, just getting things here, if you're used to Amazon Prime, 1 hour, you get whatever you want. It's a little bit of a different consumer experience, right?
Yeah, Amazon now is like Amazon sometime fairly soon in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah. Now, so definitely, yeah, and this has been really cool. I've enjoyed that we can explore a lot. For folks that want to dig in a bit further on CastAI, obviously we'll have links to the site. And what's the best way if they want to reach out to you? You really we covered a lot of ground, both technically and business wise. So you've got a lot of information, and I thank you for sharing it all.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a lot of fun. You can just hit me up on LinkedIn. That's the only social network that I use. I'm not on Twitter, Facebook, or I guess Clubhouse now counts because I've tried it.
We're all going to be there. I joke with people that say, like, I'm on Clubhouse, but .io. I'm on the real
Yeah.
club. Like, I'm over that other Clubhouse too, but
Yeah. So yeah, just hit me up on LinkedIn, and also on Cast if you want to give it a try, and you want to actually experience what a multi-cloud simultaneous application. We have a demo app, like it's a boutique app that you can deploy on 2 or 3 clouds. One of the things that we're doing is if customers sign up and you just want to try it, but you don't want to use your AWS or Google credentials, just hit us up on Slack and we'll enter credentials into your account on your behalf so that you can actually spin up a cluster at no cost on our dime, basically. Try it out. It's a 48-hour thing, and then spin it down once you've experienced it. So I encourage folks to try it. It's a really fun experience when you get the front door entry to a cluster that's actually distributed across clouds. It's a lot of fun.
that's cool. Yeah, and also it's such a beautiful customer focused and customer centric thing. Like, if you can't get it, then we'll put it in your hands anyways. So it's nice to see that's happening, because it is tough, when you tell people like this is possible, then the first thing they think is like, oh, I've got to set up IAM principles and Azure principles and all this craziness. Like, oh, well, we can make it a little bit easier for you. So to kick the nice.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting stuff coming down. That's one of the things we realized is customers want to step into the experience a little bit more gradually. So we have a read-only agent that's going to be coming out soon, where you can just install it on an existing cluster. We'll gather a lot of information. We'll give you a report of what's possible, what's not possible. So there's a lot of cool things coming kind of on the onboarding space to make it a lot. The other thing that we realized is that customers are pretty happy with their managed service provider, and trusting a young company is another friction point. So we're just going to meet customers where they are. Like, if you want the first experience with Cast, you can install it on your existing K8s cluster. You're not going to get all of the multi-cloud benefits, but you will get a lot of the advantages, and then you can start rolling from there. So,
very cool.
Eric, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. Great questions. And I listened to your discussion with Thomas, who
nice, yeah,
on Cilium. just a plug, we also install Cilium in our clusters as a de facto CM. So way faster than those other guys. So,
yeah, well, that's always the I feel the pain of that, having deployed a lot of different service meshes and network meshes, like, oh, good golly, and so yeah, Thomas was really cool to chat with, and I've got a lot of good friends that are working over it. That's it. A lot of good friends that work over at Isovalent. There's a small group of people, and I've been lucky enough to be friends with most of them. So it was really cool. Awesome. Well, Leanne, thank you very much. And like I said, we'll make sure we send people over. I know for sure I'm going to be kicking the tires on the platform a bit more aggressive myself. Sadly, I had a busy last couple of weeks, so I didn't get a chance to run in advance of our chat, but you've definitely excited me about why I should do it.
Yeah, kick the tires. The biggest thing that we would love to hear is just people's raw feedback. So this is why we made the platform so open. The more folks we can have on the platform, the better it's going to be over time.
I love it. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Leanne.
Thanks, Eric.